Florida license, NTJ 891. It's a black Monte Carlo, 2 males in it, NTJ 891.
And let's try and yank that guy.
Let's get up here and let's stop him if we have to. Okay, hold on, man, till we get enough people up there. All right, blow up here. They're making a right turn on 117. Right on 117.
Hey, we're right behind you, man. If you want to do it, let's do it.
Just look down on their side, holding up something in the front. Let's do it. Tell any car stop, let's do it.
There's a gunfight going outside my office window. They shoot guns and machine guns.
Multiple rounds of gunfire being fired down the street. 2 cars are parked. There are people screaming.
There's some kind of a gunfight or something going outside my house. There's a lot of gunfight going on in here. I don't know if the police are there or not.
There were so many thoughts going through my mind during the shootout. The immense volume of fire, especially the crack of Platts 223, immediately brought back memories for me of Vietnam. There was the dust, the noise level, the people getting shot, the inability to see the enemy at times, the overall frustration, the loss of friends. It was a firefight.
Nothing is more terrible than a battle won, except a battle lost. It was a terrible battle to win, but we lost so much.
What you just saw were actual scenes and some reenactments of a tragic situation that occurred a little over a year ago in Miami, Florida. It's a scene many of us are all too familiar with. 2 law enforcement officers were slain and 5 were wounded, 3 of them critically. In 1987, 73 law enforcement officers in this country lost their lives in felony confrontations. When even 1 officer is killed, that's 1 too many. Good morning and welcome to our October 12th teleconference on officer safety. I'm Les Davis. In spite of the excellent training most of us receive, the loss of life in the line of duty still happens. Risking our life is an expected part of our profession. In spite of training and careful planning, many things can go wrong. But none of us can ever afford to feel so confident as to say that it will not happen to me. Our program today will examine shooting situations, behavioral mannerisms of armed suspects, some consideration that administrators and supervisors should think about concerning personnel involved in shooting incidents, and some training issues about officer safety and firearms. Our panelists are Sean Grennan, retired from the New York City Police Department. Good morning, Sean.
Good morning, Les.
John Gray, a special agent with the FBI. John, good morning.
Good morning, Les.
Gordon McNeil, supervisory special agent with the FBI, who you heard in that first scene that you saw. Good morning, Gordon.
Good morning, Les.
And Bob Gallagher, also retired from the New York City Police Department. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us.
My pleasure.
Okay, we have a new opening look on LESTN, and I think it reinforces the hope we have for the future of the network. The shields represent the local, state, and federal agencies. We hope LESTN will be a network all agencies will want to use to teleconference your programs over. We also have a change of coordinates for our broadcast next Wednesday, October 19th, on crisis management. Now, that teleconference will be on SpaceNet 1, transponder 4, channel 7. Again, those are the coordinates for the crisis management teleconference on the Atlanta and Oakdale prison sieges, October 19th. That's next Wednesday. The time of the teleconference will be the same. I'll repeat this information later in the program. Now, also on December 14th, our topic will be on the 9mm pistol, issues and training, rather than on organizational communication. Now, many departments have expressed a high degree of importance in addressing this matter. Now, that's December 14th, the 9mm pistol, issues and training, rather than managing through organizational communication. Now, we'll give you the opportunity to give us your questions following today's presenters. Now, you might want to write the telephone number down, which is appearing on your screen. We have several lines open at that number. Now, keep trying with your call if you don't get through the first time. You might also want to write your question down. Remember that your questions are important to us, and that's what makes teleconferencing work. Please keep your questions addressed to our topic today, though. Okay, I think it's about time that we get started, so let's meet our first presenter, Sean Grennan. He's retired from the New York City Police Department and is now an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice, Long Island University, Brookville, New York. During his New York City Police Department career, he served in the Detective Bureau for 14 of his 21 years of service. While assigned there, his investigative duties included working homicide, robbery, burglary, and sex offenses. He concluded his service as a faculty member of the Police Academy, where he served in the Advanced and Specialized Training Unit. His area of instruction at the Long Island University are policing and forensic psychology. He's a native of Queens, New York City, and he received his bachelor's degree and also a master's degree from John Jay College, New York, a master's degree in philosophy from the City University of New York City, and a doctorate from that same university in criminal justice. Sean's also a graduate of the 118th FBI National Academy Session, a member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the New York City Police Department, Honor Legion, and the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. I think that gives us a pretty good idea of who Sean is. Let's meet Sean right now, and Sean, go ahead. You're going to talk to us a little bit about some studies and some statistics to set the stage, and I'll let you tell us about it.
Thank you, Les. This morning I would like to discuss the significance of a study that I conducted on the involvement of police personnel in violent confrontations with citizens in New York City in 1983. This study involved the analysis of over 150 incident-related variables. Excuse me. The original focus of the study was to analyze the way male and female police officers handle violent confrontations and to find out if there were any significant differences between the male and female officers. This study enabled me to profile police officers, suspects, and circumstances surrounding a total of 3,701 violent confrontations. Of that 3,701 confrontations, 341 of them were shooting incidents, and 3,360 of them were assault incidents. Info on these incidents was made available to me by the New York City Police Department from their firearms discharge assault on officer reports from 1983. But these findings relate to all law enforcement agencies throughout the United States. And any study conducted on any other law enforcement agency would probably have similar results. The majority excuse me, of prior research relating to firearms discharges, but there has been a majority of prior research in this area has related to firearms discharges, but none of these studies has thoroughly examined the profiling of officers, suspects, and circumstances surrounding police involvement in violent confrontations with citizens. This New York PD survey of 3,701 confrontations. Included in that area are 341 shooting incidents. Of the 341 shooting incidents, 80 are gunfire exchanges initiated by suspects. So therefore, 24% of all shooting incidents involve gunfire exchanges. And once again, 3,360 assault incidents. The first profile I would like to discuss relates to officers and their involvement in the 341 shooting incidents. The major significance of this study is that 93 males were involved in prior shooting incidents but no females were involved in prior shooting incidents. This indicates that approximately 3 out of every 10 shooting incidents will involve an officer who has prior experience in a shooting. Now, I would also like to discuss experience here. Prior research has indicated that the shooter in most incidents will be an officer with less experience, an officer with 1 to 5 years experience. Now, when we look at these two areas on the chart, we discover there's discharge and assault and discharge. Discharges are incidents where a firearm is discharged and there is no assault involved on the officer, while assault and discharge is exactly that, incident where an assault precedes the firearm's discharge. This chart indicates that officers with less seniority are more likely to shoot in non-crime related situations, while officers with more seniority are more likely to shoot in a crime-related situation. As I previously stated, all prior research has indicated that the officer with less seniority is more likely to shoot. My research has shown that the officer with the most seniority is more likely to shoot, and the type of incident he is more likely to shoot in is a crime-related type of situation. Now, the second profile will deal with the subject who is involved in the shooting incident with the police. When we look at the subject profile, it indicates to us that the male subject or suspect is of average height with a prior arrest record and is most likely to use a firearm against an officer and is more of a threat than a shorter or taller person. Injury-wise, when we eliminate, which you'll see later why, 117 of the 314 shootings because they did not deal with a suspect, we find that over 50% of the suspects in shooting incidents with police will more than likely be injured or killed. In all these incidents, approximately 80% of the suspects are armed. The third type of profile I would like to discuss relates to situations and circumstances surrounding incidents that involve police officers. The first part of this situational confrontational circumstances indicates that there is a need for increased training in the handling of guns by police officers. When we look at arrest-related, response-related, and other we find is shootings that are called accidental, animal, or other. Accidental would be a shooting involving possibly one police officer or maybe two in a locker room where the gun went off accidentally. Animal are basically cases that involve the officer shooting dogs. Other are situations where the officer is under mental duress or has had a few drinks and fires his gun either in the air or in his garage. This signifies that there is definitely, when we consider that 26%, counting accidental and other, of the shootings involve accidental and or other types of shootings, there is a definite need for officers to have increased training in the handling of guns. And I ask this question, is there a better way to handle situations involving dogs? Do police officers have to shoot dogs? Now, with other types of shooting incidents surrounding situations and circumstances, we find that with shooting incidents, most shooting incidents will take place outdoors. And more than likely, the situation is going to be an assault and discharge type of situation. 30% of all shootings are shootouts, where, once again, the suspect initiates the shooting. More likely to occur when the officer is on duty, and more likely to occur when the officer is working with a partner. The majority of shootings are within 30 feet and the officer has already drawn his firearm, and the shots are fired double action. Now, when we discuss hits, we have to remember that 39% hits is awful high. 39% hits involves all firearm discharges, while in shootouts, the hit rate is 16% or less for most departments throughout the United States. Once again, most shootings involve double action. Approximately 4% of all shootings involve single action, and the incredible part about that, in single action shooting, there is 100% hits. There are very few, once again, there are very few hits for police in shootouts. And another area here is prior knowledge of the situation. In only 44% of these situations, the officer had prior knowledge of what type of a situation he was coming upon. This leads us to believe that the knowledge of dangerous of most situations to the officer is very limited. I found myself, from my experience in the police department, I was involved in 2 separate shootings. The first incident came over the radio as a burglary in progress. When my partner and I responded to the scene, the complainant was downstairs on the bottom floor of a 6-story building waiting for us. He brought us up to the 6th floor, and each of us stood on one side of the door. The suspects started coming out the door. They saw us and ran back in. The first suspect immediately dove through a glass window onto the fire escape. The second suspect followed, but the third suspect, seeing he could not get out the window, spun with a gun in his right hand, and I shot him. I had no knowledge at that time or any time prior that this suspect had a gun in his hand. In the second incident, with 2 of my partners, we were out on a robbery investigation, and with 2 complainants. We got to the scene of the robbery, and the complainants identified a suspect in the robbery. While there, a non-participant in the crime approached my partner and punched him in the face twice, then backed off and took a .22 revolver out of his back pocket and started firing at us. Needless to say, in neither one of the incidents I was involved did I have any knowledge whatsoever that the suspect would have a gun available to him. Another area is off-duty shootings. Off-duty shootings indicate from the study that most off-duty incidents are more likely to involve a male officer with less than 5 years in the department in a non-crime related situation. In other words, only 32% of the off-duty shootings involved a crime. Reason for officer firing: when we look at this, we find that basically the officer is more likely to get involved in a situation that involves protection of his safety. Very few incidents involve protection of a citizen's safety. And once again, we look at accidental discharge and animal shootings. There is an awful lot of these shootings. There is definitely a need for an increased firearms training. Now I'd like to move on to assault incidents involving police officers. There is a total of 3,360 incidents involved in my research project. Of these incidents, I will now analyze the assault incidents. None of these incidents involved firearms. And I'd like to profile the officer who was involved in an assault type of incident. Majority of the officers have less than 5 years experience. And in looking at the significance of this table, it indicates to me that an officer with less than 5 years is more likely to get involved in an assault incident than any other type of officer. All officers, or just about all officers, are likely to get injured. This indicates a necessity for a more intensive confrontational tactics training and the maintenance of physical and medical standards for all police departments. A program was recently put into effect by the California Highway Patrol that everyone appointed to their department since 1984 has to yearly pass a physical and medical test. Otherwise, they will be dismissed from the department. They also includes a monies in their salary related to them maintaining physical and medical standards. Now looking at the subject profile in relationship to assault incidents. What this indicates to me, more so than the shooting incidents, is that there is a closer correlation between officer and suspect in the areas of age, height, and weight, and that the taller and heavier person is more likely to assault an officer. Now we consider the injury rate for suspects in these incidents. We find that only 25% of the suspects are injured in these types of incidents, while in the shooting incidents, 55% of the suspects are injured. What I do find incredible is the fact that 95% of the officers are injured in assault incidents and only 25% of the suspects. Now, in continuing my profile, I'd like to analyze situations and circumstances surrounding these assaults. The first area we will look at is time of day, day, month, arrest-related, response-related. As far as arrest-related, most of those incidents involve situations on the street where the officer has not received a call, he's on patrol, he observes a situation on the street, or somebody comes to the radio call or approaches them on foot patrol and tells them they have a problem. A good deal of these situations involve family disputes or fights in the street. Looking at these situations by location, duty, and uniform, non-uniform, the significant point I'd like to I came up with here is that officers are more likely to be involved in assault incidents when on duty and in uniform. While when we consider off-duty, officers are more likely to be alone when involved in off-duty assault incidents. Continuing the profile of officer involved in assault incidents, we look at knowledge of situation. This I find to be a major problem, that only 7% of officers responding to a scene of a possible assault situation have knowledge of what they're approaching. Injuries, 95% of the officers were injured and 9% were hospitalized. I also analyzed within this area male-female patrol teams and the injury rate. Most male personnel feels that in a confrontation involving a male and female officer and a suspect, that the female is more likely to get injured. This is not true. I found that with male-female patrol teams and their involvement in violent confrontations, that the male will be injured 53% of the time, and the female will be injured 47% of the time. Therefore, there is absolutely no difference in the way the male or female handle a violent confrontation. Now, some implications and the findings. What I found from this research is that female officers tend to handle violent confrontations in the same manner as male officers, whether with partner or without partner. Another finding relates to shootings. Male officers were involved in 329 shooting incidents, while female officers were only involved in 12. This indicates to me that the male officer is much more likely to use his weapon than the female officer. One area within here I'd like to discuss is that the 12 shootings involving female officers, 86% of those shootings involved using a gun against a suspect, while only 60% of the shootings involving male officers involved shooting of suspects. The female officer at no time discharged her gun accidentally. At no time did the female officer ever shoot at a dog, and at no time was she involved in a shooting of another kind. Therefore, there's 117 shooting incidents that don't involve suspects that female officers did not shoot their guns. Another part with the female, whether she is alone or with a partner, the female officers are involved in a higher proportion of violent confrontations than their proportionate representation in the police department. I'll go a little further in explaining that. I took all male-female teams, and then I took and compared them to all male-male teams. Now what I found is proportionately in the New York City Police Department, 7.3% of the department in 1983 was female. And yet working with partners, 15% of the females were involved in violent confrontations. That is double the amount of females members of the department. And it shows us that the female is unafraid to get involved in that street fight. She's going to jump in there and be with you. No matter what you think, it's factual now. Working alone, once again, proportionately, they were only supposed to be involved in 7.3 of the incidents involving assaults on officers. They rated a little higher, and they came in at 9.2% of the incidents, which indicates, once again, they're just as likely to get involved in a violent confrontation alone as is the male officer. They're not stepping back and walking into the closet. It's time for departments to stop locking them in the station house and letting them go out on the posts where they belong, because they can do the job just as well as the male officer can. Some other implications or findings in my study are that officers are more likely to be injured in less overtly threatening situations. And once again, this goes back to the type of information being fed to them by the dispatcher. The dispatcher has to try and get as much information available to the officer responding to the scene. There is no need for an officer to walk upon the scene of a family dispute where there's been 3 prior calls there and he has no knowledge of this, and as soon as he walks in the door, he gets knocked on his butt. The dispatcher has a specific job to inform the officer that he is going to a scene where there has been 3 or 4 prior calls and there is either a violent male or female at that scene. Another finding, officers with no prior firearms discharges, shooting incidents, are more likely to be injured than officers with prior firearms discharges. Again, are we talking about the Dirty Harry or John Wayne syndrome with the officer with a prior firearms discharge? Does he jump to the front and take over the scene? Yet he doesn't get injured. It's the guy who's never been involved in a shooting incident, possibly doesn't know what to expect when he gets on the scene of these types of incidents, and ultimately gets injured. Another finding, older officers working alone have a higher probability of being injured in an assault incident than a younger officer. I once again go back to the physical and medical examinations. Looking at old officers, in a lot of cases, they're out of shape. Some of them are anywhere from 10 to 100 pounds overweight. They're inclined to heart disease and injuries on the street, especially when you're dealing with a suspect who's 25 years old or younger. How is a 45-year-old man who weighs 250 pounds going to handle a 25-year-old kid who weighs 180 pounds and only has 5% of his body contains body fat? Younger officers are more likely to get injured in firearm incidents than older officers, and that goes back to inexperience. Also, it shows the need for more training for your younger officers, more firearms training. We have to get to the range, and departments have to send us for firearms training more than twice a year. There's a definite need to shoot anywhere. Some departments shoot anywhere from 50 to maybe 250 rounds a year. Departments have to get involved, more thoroughly involved in firearms training, and the officer should be shooting at least 2,000 rounds a year and spending at least 5 to 6 days a year at the range undergoing training. And I can, once again, with training, with my involvement in 2 shooting incidents, training helps you survive. I was properly trained by the people at the New York City Police Department outdoor range. And when I was involved in both those shooting incidents, I never had time to think. I responded to my training. The possibility is if I would have had time to think, I would have been standing there in the second incident and caught one in the chest. I stepped to my left, went into a crouch position, and took aim and fired at the suspect as the suspect fired at me. Training is good. There has to be more training related to firearms discharges. Other findings: 34% of shooting incidents involved discharging a firearm at other than a suspect or an attacker. Once again, I go back and look at the accidental shootings, the dog shootings, and the other shootings. There should not be 117 incidents of this type in police work. Maybe the officers don't realize the dangerousness of a gun. There's no need for officers to go into the locker room in a station house and play with a gun. A recent incident that took place in policing involved 2 officers in a locker room with a semi-automatic off-duty. The one officer dropped the clip out of the semi-automatic and stuck it into his partner's back pocket and pulled the trigger. Needless to say, he received no training whatsoever in the handling of a semi-automatic pistol and never realized that there was still a round in the chamber. Another finding relates that approximately 30% of shooting officers have been involved in prior shooting incidents, which means approximately 3 out of every 10 incidents, as I stated before, involve officers who have used their gun before. Some of them as many as 6 times. I think there is need for retraining of all officers who are involved in shooting and the psychological analysis of each officer after he is involved in a shooting incident. Documentation is a key. Is there a possibility that an officer who's involved in 6 shootings is going to be involved in 6 more shootings in his 20-year career? If he is, the department should document all the information on him, and he should no longer be a member of a police department in the United States. Now, some implications to the agency. There is a need today for agencies to provide more substantial information to officers responding to calls. It's cheaper to have the information and the equipment available to give the information to the officer than it is to lose an officer's life or have an officer in a hospital for 3 months with an injury, for an officer to get out of a department on 3/4 disability. Better to provide the information and the officer knows what type of situation he's going to be walking into. There is a definite need for intensive confrontational tactics training in policing. There is also a definite need for further communication skills training in policing, and physical conditioning is the key. Most departments require their officers to stay at least 20 years, and most of us, after a period of time from sitting in a radio car, eating pizza and drinking coffee and eating donuts, put on quite a few pounds. All departments have to crack down and make it a point to keep all their officers in top physical shape so they can survive any type of incident they may come upon, whether it be an assault incident or a shooting incident. Policy need for departments. Once again, I go back to the physical standards testing and medical exams testing. California Highway Patrol in this program, in the most recent survey, found that 97.5% of their females passed the exam. 96% of the males passed the exam. Their rate of injuries has decreased since they put this program into effect. And although it is a little costly because they pay their officers approximately $65 a month for the first 5 years and then $130 a month for people with over 5 years in the department, it's worthwhile. The injury rates are going down, even considering the heart bill cases, the people getting out of the department and have a heart attack when they're off duty, have decreased since they put this program into effect. There has to be stricter guidelines set by all police departments in the areas of the use of deadly force and physical force. What types of situations? Why is an officer getting overly involved when he need not be in a violent confrontation or a confrontation between a husband and wife? Would it be better for him to step back and let them argue it out? Some research has been done in the area of once again, domestic violence by organizations in the United States, and they're not the answer. You don't go in and every type of number one situation and lock somebody up. Doesn't work. You're going to end up in a fist fight. Standards have to be set that the officer knows exactly when he can use deadly physical force and exactly when he can use physical force. The last area I'd like to look at is supervisory responsibility on situations involving both deadly force and physical force. In today's day and age, we find that there is a vast increase in the number of suits against police departments under federal law 1983, and a good deal of these suits involve vicarious liability. Departments have to properly train supervisors so they can train their subordinates in handling of any type of situation they may face while on duty in the street and off duty. Don't forget, in the late 1960s, there were approximately 1,700 cases involving liability in 1983 law. Today, there are approximately 26,000 cases a year being brought against police departments, and this number is going to increase. The time has come for police departments to get into more intensive training for their officers. And the time has also come to look at what the female officer is doing. Why is she not shooting in 117 types of situations? The need is for a study to review female police officers and why they don't shoot in these types of situations. The need is to find out why and to implement that into training for male officers. And hopefully, with that being done, there'll be a decrease in the amount of accidental dog and other shootings for police departments throughout the United States.
Okay, Sean, thank you very much. And I think there's a lot that you gave us that has an awful lot of messages in there for us. There's a lot of implications that we can draw from the statistics you gave us. A lot of things that maybe we might be doing the right way, too, from some of the statistics that you mentioned.
Yes.
And I'm going to give each one of you guys the opportunity to add anything or your own observations or questions you might have for Sean about the statistics that he gave in just a minute. But I do want to tell you, the viewers, now that this is an opportunity for you to call with your questions. I hope you wrote the number down so that you can reach us here. Give us your questions. Sean gave an awful lot of information there, a lot of good statistical information, and we would like to hear from you. So we'll take your calls at this time. We'll have time for just a few brief calls. Before we take the calls, though, Bob, you're an experienced law enforcement officer, and from what Sean said, does any of that information trigger any questions or responses from you?
Well, I was very interested, Les, by the statistics that Sean gave, and I was wondering why the more experienced officer tended to be involved. I often wondered whether the more experienced officer, because of his ability, would be more likely to get in situations involving grave danger, because maybe knowing what he's looking for on the street, knowing particular high crime areas of a particular precinct he's working in, or being the first to respond to heavy situations. Do you have any idea, Sean, why? Or your own opinions on?
Well, considering that if we look at the 341 shooting incidents, it was a 50-50 breakup on whether uniform or plain clothes. And I would have to say that the majority, from the information I've gathered, the majority of shootings in plain clothes involve officers with a higher amount of seniority. Therefore, they're getting involved in serious crime situations to use their gun, while the younger officer is basically, in a lot of cases, just toying with his gun or shooting accidentally, shooting at animals, shooting at others. The older officer seems to be walking into situations that involve serious crimes, and he's making a proper judgment in the use of his revolver.
Do you think it's possible that the more seasoned officer is more likely to see either the armed suspect or the heavy-duty crime than the less seasoned officer, and possibly this is a reason why?
I would say definitely.
Okay.
An officer over a period of time trains himself to look at people, and by doing that, he is going to pick out a suspect a lot faster than a younger officer.
All right, let me remind the viewers that right now we will take your telephone calls. Any questions that you have that you would like to get asked at this time, we have a few minutes to do that. So now's the time. Dial us, give us your questions. We'll take them for a few minutes now if you have any at this point. Gordon, let me ask you, or John, either one of you now, if you've got any comments or any questions about the statistics that John gave. I know we're going to talk about training and we're going to talk about physical training, John, in just a little while, but any questions that either one of you might have or any comments?
Sean, I was wondering, do you have any plans to update that survey on a continuing basis so we're aware of all the information on a continuing basis?
The major problem I face is getting information. When I originally got this information, I was still a member of the New York City Police Department. The problem I'm running into is getting information now that I'm no longer a member of a law enforcement agency. I hope to get information. What I'd like to do is look at 4 specific areas: the East Coast, the Middle West, the South, and the Far West, and to see if there's any changes in the type of shooting incidents. I would specifically like to look at the West Coast, and knowing from the knowledge I've gathered and reading that the West Coast police departments receive far more training than the East Coast police departments do.
There's a number of other questions that just come to mind. There's an interesting point that I want to make about the officer involved in an assault versus the officer involved in a firearm discharge. But first, we're getting ready to take a call here from our first caller, and it will be from Detective Earl Aldrich with the Colorado Springs Police Department. Detective, you're on the air. Go ahead with your question, and please stay on the air until we've answered it. Get that call in just a second. All right. John, go ahead.
Less from a firearm standpoint, being a firearms instructor, I think it was interesting to note along the same line with it seems that the rookie officer seems to get involved in a violent confrontation, as does an officer who's a seasoned police officer with years of experience. But it seems at the mid-level, it's almost like a curve. In the middle part of your career, you've gained that experience and perhaps have learned to deal with it through verbalization or dealing with a situation with something other than deadly force. However, later in your career, perhaps you've been accelerated to a management position or a non-street related crime position. And then when you are confronted, perhaps because of your experience and your years in tenure, you haven't attended firearms training, or you feel that you no longer need the training, therefore you know what you're supposed to do. But when hit with the reality of a violent confrontation, I think being away from training may be a key factor there.
Okay, good. Let's get to our first call. We do have a caller waiting. Detective Earl Aldrich from the Colorado Springs Police Department. Sorry I couldn't get your call a minute ago, but go ahead, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. How are you today? My question is, how many of these subjects were wanted, went on warrants that were in confrontations with firearms and so on?
Very few of them. I would say 6%.
That is my question. I have another officer here who has another question, okay? 1 second. Hello, sir? Hello?
Go ahead.
This is Officer Tarvin, Colorado Springs Police Department. I have a question in regards to why is it that more officers are injured than suspects in confrontations?
Okay, good question.
I feel that the reasoning for that is that officers are not in the physical condition they should be in. There could be a problem there. If I look back at a study done on injuries to officers from the 70s, only 40% of the officers were injured, while today it's 90% of the officers are injured. It could be that the union has some input into officer injury. In fact, so few of the officers, only 9% went to the hospital. I'd have to feel that since the late 70s, going into the 80s, union influence in stating that if you're injured in any way, claim the injury. Because down the road, when you're ready to retire, you might be able to get some type of medical disability from that injury. I feel that has a big effect on the injury rate.
I'd like to add something just on that, if I could.
Okay.
I think that it's a combination of, number one, I think maybe our confrontation methods when we're confronting a suspect could be a little better, that we're not constantly alert or prepared for it. But I think what we also have to remember is that the person we are confronting in almost all cases is going to be the one that is going to initiate the assault, whether it be physical or with a weapon. He is initiating the assault, and therefore we as officers will be more likely to be injured than him. He is striking first, so to speak.
That's a very good point. That's right. All right, let's take another question right now, and this is from Deputy Sheriff John Moore, Meade County Sheriff's Department in South Dakota. Go ahead, John, you're on the air, and please stay on the air till we answer your question.
Yes, sir. I was wondering, how did weapon retention in assaultive confrontations affect the outcomes of the confrontation, and was the use of the officer's own weapon figured into these statistics?
Okay. All right, did you get that, Sean?
Yes, I did. It seems from the study I've done that there were only 2 incidents where the officer's weapon was removed, and in neither one of those cases was a weapon used against the officer. In other words, what happened, the weapon was removed and the officer recovered the weapon almost immediately. In most of these cases, the suspect had his or her own weapon. It's unusual because I know in '86 there were 6 incidents where officers were shot with their own gun. But in '83, there were 2 where the gun was taken away, but the officer got the gun back immediately and he was not shot with his own weapon.
Okay, very good. How's that?
Good enough. Thank you.
Thank you for your call. Okay, the next caller is Sergeant Joseph Bishop with the Metro Nashville, Tennessee Police Department. Joe, go ahead with your question, please.
You and the confrontations with the officers.
All right, Joe, could you repeat the question for us, please? We lost a little bit of it.
Statistically, did you ever look at the race of the suspects who assaulted the officers and come up with any figures on that?
Okay. Okay, hold on a second. The race of the subjects that were involved, or race of officers involved, Sean?
Yes, I did. And give me about 10 seconds. With the officer profile, in assault incidents, I found that 80% of the officers, the male officers, were white, and 76% of the female officers were white that were involved in these types of confrontations. When I look at that, is actually the breakdown with New York City. Approximately 80% of the department is white, 10% is Hispanic, and 10% is black. When I looked at the subject race who was involved in the assault incidents, 40% of the suspect who was assaulting the officer, 40% were black, 24% white, and 21% were Hispanic. Now, with the shooting incidents, 76% of the male officers involved in shooting incidents were white, and 90% of the female officers involved in shooting incidents were white. When I looked at the suspect, I found that shooting at a police officer. 71 of the suspects were white, 122 were black, and 81 of the suspects were Hispanic.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sean. And let's go to the next caller now, who's Police Officer Jack Shell with the Champaign, Illinois Police Department. Go ahead, Jack. You're on the air.
Am I there? Hello?
Go ahead.
I've got a problem with your officer assaults in that the increased civil liability on the street officer and department regulations prevent them from taking action against the suspect. And I was wondering, do the regulations, do you have a department regulation like through the use of nightsticks, and is it real stringent when this study was done?
Okay, good question. Now, please stay on the air until we answer it. Go ahead, Sean.
Basic policy relating to assault incidents has to do with the gun, and the gun not coming out of the holster in an assault incident, unless your life or another person's life is in danger. There's no basic restrictions on the use of a nightstick. The only restriction is on the use. You cannot use a blackjack. So the nightstick can be used in any type of assault incident, as can your fist and feet.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Thank the other callers for your questions, and we'll get back and give you the opportunity to ask more questions in just a little while. But from the responses that I receive and the ones received by the Kansas City Police Department, we think that this method of training and education is worthwhile. But we do need your input to confirm this. Each mailing list recipient is soon to receive a computerized form for this broadcast and for next week's broadcast. We're going to ask your viewing site location and information concerning attendees. We'll also ask you to give attendees reaction and evaluation about our program format and material. There'll be a self-addressed stamped envelope included for returning the form to us. Now, please take the time to fill it out and return it to us, and it will assist us in planning future programs. It'll also help keep us, our mailing list accurate and up to date. In the future, you'll receive this form before the broadcast. But the new system for getting out brochures to you we'll put in place too, I hope, but it's taking some time for us to develop that. Now, we are working on it, so I ask you again to please be patient with us, and we'll have it in place. Okay, let's get back to the program, and our next presenters are going to give you some thoughts and ideas that are based on their own personal experiences. Now, both of them are veteran law enforcement officers, and their records speak for themselves. I know both of them will respond to your questions, and I think that they both have a lot to talk about. Robert Gallagher is a retired veteran of the New York City Police Department, as I said, having served 18 years with that department. He's now a consultant in security. He's also an instructor in police-related subjects, and he regularly lectures throughout the Northeast. While he was with the New York City Police Department, he was assigned to the Detective Bureau for most of his career. The majority of those assignments as a detective were in the street crime and the anti-robbery tactical units. During the course of his police career, he was involved in more than 1,200 armed confrontations and arrest situations. More than 1,200. He's been shot at 7 times, and he was fortunate not to have been hit on any of those occasions. On 2 of the occasions, though, he fired at and disabled both subjects. Now, I talked to Bob, and he said that he credits his fortune in not being hit to a combination of good training, using the proper tactics, common sense, and perhaps some luck. He's attended St. John's University, New York City, and he studied political science. He's also the recipient of 211 awards of meritorious service from the New York City Police Department, and he's the highest decorated detective in that department, in that New York City Police Department. In May 1984, he received the New York Officer of the Year Award from Governor Cuomo. I'm very glad to have you with us, Bob.
Thank you very much, Les. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Also, we'll go right to Gordon McNeil, who is a supervisory special agent assigned to his current office since 1982. He began his career in the Philadelphia office, and he's been assigned investigative duties in the Detroit and Pittsburgh divisions. In 1975, he was promoted to the organized crime section at FBI headquarters, and he was responsible for the organized crime investigative programs in the western United States. In 1978, he was transferred to Miami as the supervisor of the organized crime squad. Then he was promoted to assistant special agent in charge of our Houston office. After sustaining an injury while he was in Houston, he requested to be transferred back to Miami. He was, and he supervised bank robbery, armored car robbery, kidnapping, and fugitive violations. On April 11th, 1986, Gordon was seriously wounded along with 4 other special agents in an arrest situation involving the 2 armed and dangerous fugitives we showed you in the beginning of the program. 2 of those special agents were slain on that day, along with 2 felony subjects. After sustaining 9 wounds himself, one of the subjects continued to fire his weapon, killing the 2 agents. Gordon's also been involved in 3 other armed confrontations involving arrests. These were wanted individuals. Gordon received his bachelor's degree from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's a graduate of the Executive Development Institute of the FBI Academy, and he's also an experienced agent, and he regularly instructs in a number of police subjects. And Gordon, I'd like to thank you for being on the program with us this morning, too.
Thank you, Les.
Now, I'll give you a chance, Gordon, to talk about some of the experiences that you've had in a little while. But first of all, Bob, that is quite an honor to be the most decorated detective in the city of New York, and I congratulate you on that.
Thank you very much.
I also congratulate you on having survived in those number of situations that you did. You are a veteran of a large department, Bob, and you've had a lot of experiences that many people in smaller departments don't have the opportunity to experience. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about the assignments you had during the time that you were with the New York City Police Department, the Detective Bureau.
Well, I first joined the New York City Police Department as a police trainee in August of 1967. And after serving as a trainee for a little over a year, I graduated from the police academy, and as a rookie patrolman, I was sent to the Tactical Patrol Force. The Tactical Patrol Force was a arrest-oriented unit which worked steady night tours and concentrated its efforts in the highest crime areas of the city.
So you were on full-time night work?
Yeah,
at that
that
time?
was in a uniform detail, and I stayed there until 1973. From 1973 through 1984, I was assigned again in specialized street crime units in specialized divisions of the street crime and the central robbery division units. Again, we concentrated on the highest crime areas in the city, and we worked steady nights, but this time we worked in civilian clothes, utilizing blending tactics and other undercover tactics, unmarked autos, cabs, surveillance techniques, and I stayed there until my last 2 years on the job. I spent a year first as an instructor at the advanced training section of the police academy, and then I went to the Brooklyn Homicide Squad and concluded my career at the Joint Organized Crime Task Force.
Okay, when you say that you were assigned to the high crime rate areas in the city, Bob, were you working out of one precinct or were you working the entire city?
Well, we were working the entire city. We were concentrating our efforts on whatever areas there was the highest incidence of violent street crime. In both the street crime and central robbery division units, we worked the whole city and covered it, and in the tactical patrol force, but we would move from area to area wherever the violent crime seemed to be peaking.
Okay, how many people were involved in this specialized unit when you were going all over the city that way? About how many people did you work with?
Well, I worked within a squad of approximately 10 men. in the street crime unit. When we started the specialized team within the Central Robbery Division, we first had a special team of 4 men, 2 teams of 2, but the team then grew over a 3 or 4 year period to 7 men and
Okay,
a sergeant.
now, thinking back to what Sean told us, Bob, he told us that most of the crime, the assaults, both confrontations, unarmed and armed, happen in the evening. So certainly in the time that the shift work that you work, the time of the day that you work, also that they happened in good weather and all that kind of thing. But from the statistics that Sean told us, they happened in the evening when you were on duty. So I guess you had a lot of time, a lot of situations in which these would naturally occur then. Were those hours you worked early evening, late evening, or what?
Well, we'd start at 6 p.m. and our scheduled tour of duty was supposed to end at 2, but it was rarely a day that we ever got finished at 2. Usually we'd go to 3, 4, 5 in the morning as a result of arrests that we had made, booking prisoners, and finishing the paperwork.
All right, during this career, Bob, you developed an expertise for detecting people who were armed with concealed firearms, and also disarmed and arrested over 1,200 persons in your assignment, you said. Now, is there an ability that could be learned or developed and utilized by other officers? The things that made it successful for you, is there anything like that that you think other officers can actually learn from your experiences?
Oh, yes, most definitely, Les. Basically, the ability to detect the man that is carrying the concealed firearm, every one of us has within us. Most of us know these visible signs or telltale clues, but we're just not bringing them to the mind. Basically, there are a number of telltale signs or behavioral characteristics common to persons carrying concealed firearms. For the most part, they're all logical mannerisms, body movements, methods of dress, and other idiosyncrasies that are not only known by us as police officers, but in fact done by us as police officers while we're in our off-duty attire or concealing our weapons in civilian clothes.
Okay, why don't you expand on those a little bit?
Okay. Well, the problem is that most officers don't realize they have this information in their mind and that they don't take time to further develop this information they have into their everyday dealings out on the street. They're so busy handling service-oriented jobs, responding from one location to another, that they don't have the time or have taken the time to realize that at a scene they're at, there might possibly be a man armed at that scene. Maybe not the main character, but a supporting person in the crowd or somebody nearby. If they took the time to develop these skills and constantly worked on them, I think it would be, especially in today's times, of great benefit to them in keeping themselves safe. I'd like to mention some of these mannerisms, these physical characteristics, and then some of the clothing and other telltale signs that we should look for.
Okay.
But I'd like to say first that in this area, as a result of my experiences and other officers that I've worked with and shared with, is the fact that the overwhelming majority, I'd estimate 90 to 95% of illegally carried handguns on the street are carried unholstered or loose in the waistband area. When a person sticks a gun, an unnatural heavy object, in the waistband, the body starts making conscious and subconscious protective body movements in an attempt to conceal, protect, and keep the gun from slipping. I'd like to share with you first some of the most obvious physical movements and mannerisms and when they're most likely to occur.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay? If we concentrated our efforts, by the way, on the people at these times when they're more likely to make these movements, the results we'd have as officers would be amazing. You'd see how easy it is, in fact, to spot a weapon out there on the street. The first we'll start with, as a strong telltale clue, which should arouse our suspicions and tell us that possibly this man is armed with a gun, is a simple security feel or touch. An armed person, even the one carrying one legally, is constantly feeling or touching that weapon. Check yourself, watch yourself during the day. Watch other officers you work with and you socialize with, and you'll see it. We're always putting the hand to the gun.
Okay.
Okay? The person will make this touch in a number of ways, touching it with any part of his arm, from the elbow to actually putting his hand against the grip area of the gun. It'll go anything from a glancing blow, where the arm will then return to the normal position, to the hand itself actually touching the weapon and staying there for several seconds. This security feel can be made at any time, but it is made most often during or just after a physical movement by the subject.
Now, you're saying these are things that we as law enforcement officers do ourselves.
We do them
as well.
all ourselves. We
So
do
it's not
them
just
all
the subject.
ourselves. We just don't take the time
Okay.
to really watch ourselves and watch others, and then carry that same information out onto the street, watching all the people that are coming within our presence while we're out on the street.
Okay.
Bob, could I interject here for a second? Wouldn't you basically say then the best person for an officer to study in learning tactics of other people would be another police officer, to watch what they do when they're off duty or in plain clothes?
100%, right. I used to, not only was all my information or expertise developed as a result of case history or arrest on the street, but I used to sit in court every day. I'd watch every officer in civilian clothes, every way that he moved, he walked. And if you do this, you'll start to see these characteristics. I tell you that if you're not looking for, you wouldn't even look twice at. But if you're looking for them, they're so obvious they begin to jump out at you.
Okay.
The second simple and logical area, and something we're all guilty of doing, and the criminal on the street with the illegal gun is doing constantly, is a simple security peek or glance. Believe me when I tell you, we're constantly looking down at the weapon. The criminal carrying the gun illegally, though, is more often looking down at it because he has to make sure it's concealed a little better than us, because if that weapon or protrusion can be detected by us, then he knows what's going to happen to him. He's going to be arrested and possibly go to jail. I'd like to mention here quickly just a couple of things about protrusions or bulges, something we always hear about and we talk about, and something which the illegal gun carrier is usually unaware of when he dresses for the night with the gun in his waistband. We can spot that well-secreted gun in the waistband as a result of an observation made through careful scrutiny of a subject's actions. When a subject places the gun in his waistband, he's usually standing tall and erect, looking himself in the mirror, and the gun is then covered by a shirt, a sweater, or other garment. Okay. He's looking at himself rigid, and even to himself, the protrusion of the weapon is usually not detected.
You're talking about with the shirt out of the trousers standing there.
Well, yeah. The illegal gun that's carried, as I said, loose in the waistband is almost always covered by either a sweater, a jacket, a sweatshirt, some garment concealing it, a shirt worn out, or some garment that's concealing it. Sometimes it's even concealed by a shirt that is tucked into the pants and the gun is worn a little lower, sinking lower into the waistband. What I was saying is he puts this gun into his waistband and he's looking into the mirror. He's not counting on what is going to happen when his upper body turns away from the lower rigid body in any way. The rigidity of the steel of the upper end of the gun is going to cause the steel to remain standing tall while the body turns from it. This is going to cause a protrusion that we can spot. When he turns, no matter